welcome to Tools for Research Data Management. My name is Sophia Lafferty-Hess, and I'm here with my colleague Jen Dara. We are both research data management consultants working in the Center for Data and Visualization Sciences, situated within Duke University Libraries. So to tell you just a little bit more about the department where we work, this what we call CDVS for short, we have staff with expertise in various different aspects of supporting data-driven research. So expertise in data science techniques. So if you want to learn R or other programming languages such as Python, excuse me, I forgot to close a window, of course. Other staff have expertise in GIS and mapping, data visualization, and then data management, which is Jen and I's areas of expertise. So we are available for consultations, either over Zoom or in person. All of our consultation services are free to anyone at Duke, and you can email any of your questions to askdata@duke.edu, and we'll connect you with any of our staff that have the relevant expertise, or if we're not the right people to help, we can try to connect you with others at Duke. One of the other big parts of kind of our service profile within CDVS is offering open workshops throughout the semester. So this is a selection of the workshops that we're offering this fall. We're just gearing up our workshop season, so I encourage you to visit our website and check out what workshops you might be interested in. These are our live workshops. I would also note we have an online learning page where you can access a large number of recordings from our past workshops, access slides, lots of different materials for you to take part in some of that asynchronous learning kind of at your leisure. So to go briefly into the plan for today, we're going to start off with kind of a high-level overview of general research data management good practices. So we're going to try to give you some general tips and tools that you can use during your research projects. We're going to try to have a brief break to give us all just a moment to get another cup of coffee or take a stretch break. And then we're going to dig into looking at some 3 specific tools that might be used in your data management workflows. So one is LabArchives, the other one is GitHub, GitLab, and then OSF. And then we're going to try to leave some time at the end for questions and answers, and also to complete that all-important RCR attendance form. So to start off, we're going to do a little bit of framing about, well, what do we actually mean when we say the term research data? So what we'd like to do first is ask you all to put what types of data you work with in your scholarship in the chat. So I have noticed there's people from all different disciplines in this workshop. So we're really interested in kind of the scope and breadth of what people are working with, because we know research data can take many different forms. So again, just quickly add what type of data you're working with or plan to work with in your studies in the chat. And while people are adding that, I'm going to go ahead and give you a few definitions. So when we think about research data, we like to think about it from a very inclusive and multidisciplinary perspective. So this definition we really like. It comes from the Office of Management and Budget, and it says that research data are those recorded factual material commonly accepted in the research community as necessary to validate research findings. So that means it can be structured, it can be unstructured, it can be quantitative, it can be qualitative. Really, the most important part is that it's that underlying materials that you use to substantiate any claims that you make in your scholarship. So again, we think about this in a very, very broad way. When we talk about research data management, again, this is a term that can be used slightly different ways by different individuals or in different disciplines. In the libraries and archive space, often when we're talking about research data management, what we mean is caring for, facilitating access to, preserving, and adding value to research data throughout its life cycle. And this life cycle model is really an important aspect of that. So the idea with research data management is that you may gather or collect new data. You'll do your own processes to organize, transform it, process it, analyze it. And then ideally, you'll be publishing and preserving that data so that it could be potentially reused by others to answer new and novel research questions. And so in many ways, research data management, the practices will vary across disciplines, but we do think it's often both systematic and intentional, while also having a lot of space for flexibility and being organic. So it's a nice balance between those. So why is this important? So I know many of you have probably heard of the so-called reproducibility crisis. So this was a survey that was taken by Nature in 2016, where they asked scientists if they thought there was a reproducibility crisis, and we can see, 52% said either a significant crisis or 38% with a slight crisis. So I still like to reframe this not as a crisis, but an opportunity. But there obviously is something going on with the reproducibility of science at this time, whether that's reproducing somebody else's results or even just reproducing your own results. So really at a foundational level, data management facilitates the main practices you need to put in place to build a more reproducible workflow. And if you're interested in reproducibility, we're having multiple sessions on developing reproducible workflows that are coming up in the next month or so through CDVS. So I'd encourage you to check that out. Another thing that research data management can help with is really demonstrating the accountability and trustworthiness and the integrity of our research. Sadly, Duke has had a couple high-profile research misconduct cases where data or the research was falsified. One led to a very large payout to NIH. So I think as a community, we're really working to demonstrate through transparent research practices the trustworthiness of all of our scholarship. And a really fun article, if you're interested in reproducibility, that came out a few years ago. This was again in Nature, was a neuroscientist asked other scientists to see if they could go back and get their 10-year-old code to still run. Suffice it to say, there was challenges. A lot of it had to do with missing documentation. So they had to do a lot of detective work to figure out how all their files fit together, or how the code, what pieces of the code did what. And some also struggled with completely obsolete computing environments. So again, one of the aspects of data management is thinking about how we preserve our materials into the future. So not just accessing them now, but how do we make sure we can still access our data and make sense of it 5, 10, 15 years down the road. One other reason this is important is that increasingly two really important stakeholders in academia are implementing policies that are requiring some form of data sharing. So this really started in 2011 when NSF put out their data management policy. So all NSF grants for the last 10 years have required something called a data management plan being part of all grant proposal packages. Speaking of big funders, we are also looking to, in January 2023, NIH has just implemented a new policy that goes into effect for all grants funded, all grant applications going in after January 25th, 2023. And then in between these times, we've seen a lot of journal publishers also implementing their own policies. So PLOS was a big one in 2014. I imagine many of you, if you have published in a journal, have seen this, where they require a data availability statement that says where the data underlying that published article can be found for the purposes of reproducibility and verification. So there's also been a really new thing that just came out a couple weeks ago. So the Office of Science and Technology Policy has put out a new memo that has told all federal funding agencies that they need to revise their policies on public access to research to further enable and accelerate access to public research materials. So particularly article publications and research data. And we can put a link to that in the chat if you're interested in that policy. But essentially what it's saying is that all federal agencies have to have revised their policies by 2025. And one of the big things that it removed is the ability to place embargoes on article publications. They're really calling for the immediate release, public release of all materials that are being generated by federal funds. So this is, again, a big move. And I think part of the purpose of this timeline is just to show the growth from various different stakeholders in implementing these types of policies that are aimed at public access to research data. Okay, so I've talked a lot about like these external factors of why you might want to care about data management and sharing, but really the biggest reason is to help your future self. And the biggest beneficiary of some of the practices we're going to talk about today is going to be your future self, because many of us know, you're busy doing your research and you don't write something down, and then you try to go back to it in 6 months and you don't understand what you did or why you did it. So leaving those breadcrumbs can be really important. Okay, I've been talking for a while, so now we're going to watch a funny video with bears that shows kind of how this can go wrong if you don't kind of have some good data management processes in place.
Hello, my name is Dr. Judy Benign. I'm an oncologist at NYU School of Medicine.
Hello, Dr. Judy Benign.
I read your article on B-cell function. I think that I could use the data for my work on pancreatic cancer.
I am not an oncologist.
I know, but I think I could use the data for my work on pancreatic cancer. Do you have the data?
Everything you need to know is in the article.
No. What I need is the data. Will you share your data?
I am not sure that will be possible.
But your work is in PubMed Central and was funded by NIH.
That is true.
And it was published in Science, which requires that you share your data.
I did publish in Science.
Then I am requesting your data. Can I have a copy of your data?
I am not sure where my data is.
But surely you saved your data.
I did. I saved it on a USB drive.
Where is the USB drive?
It is in a box. It is in a box at home. I just moved.
But can I use your data?
There are many boxes. So many boxes. I forgot to label the boxes.
Hello again. Thank you for sending me a copy of your data on a USB drive. I received the envelope yesterday.
You are welcome, but I will need that back when you are finished. That is my only copy.
I did have a question.
What is your question? You might find the answer in my article.
No. I received the data, but when I opened it up, it was in hexadecimal.
Yes, that is right.
I cannot read hexadecimal.
You asked for my data and I gave it to you. I have done what you asked.
But is there a way to read the hexadecimal?
You will need the program that created the hexadecimal file.
Yes, I will. What is the name of the program?
Citation.
I do not know this program.
It was a very good program. The company that made the program went bankrupt in 2007.
Do you have a copy of the program?
I do not use this program anymore because the company that made it went bankrupt. Maybe you could buy a copy on eBay.
I have good news.
You again.
I talked to my colleague. She knew a person with a copy of the software.
Then why do you need me? Everything you need to know about the data is in the article.
I opened the data and I could not understand it.
If you have the program, you will find it is clear.
Well, I noticed that you called your data fields SAM. Is that an abbreviation?
Yes, it is an abbreviation of my co-author's name. His name is Samuel Lee. We call him Sam.
I see. And what is the content of the field called SAM1?
Ah, yes. SAM1 is the level of CXCR4 expression.
And what is the content of the field called SAM2?
That is logical if you think about it.
What is the content of the field called SAM2?
I don't remember.
What about SAM3? Is there a guide to the data anywhere?
Yes, of course. It is the article that is published in Science.
The article does not tell me what the field names mean. Is there any record of what these field names mean?
Yes. My co-author knows what the content of SAM2 is and SAM3 and SAM4.
Can I talk to your co-author?
I'm not sure.
I would very much like to talk to your co-author.
Well, he was a graduate student. He went back to China 2 years ago.
Can I have his contact information?
He is in China. His name is Sam Lee.
I think I cannot use your data.
You could check the article to see if what you need is there.
Please stop talking now.
All right, so we laughed some, but there's some very good lessons in this video, and we're going to try to point out some other practices that you can put into place to try to avoid being like brown bear and making panda bear so sad that you cannot extend this wonderful research that brown bear did. So I'm going to just jump into it. So first, let's talk a little bit about data management plans. As I mentioned, these are plans that often accompany a grant proposal. They're usually around 2 pages, and some of the content that's asked for, maybe things like they'll all ask what data will be used and generated. So you really need to be clear about what data you're actually going to be producing in the course of that project. It may ask who's responsible for it throughout the project, how it might be handled throughout active analysis, things around, you may want to describe things around documentation and metadata. And I've highlighted number 5 because this is one of the big things that the funder wants to know is how are you going to preserve and share that data so that it has that extended value chain beyond the original research project. So we can see that return on investment and a contribution to kind of the open research culture that we're trying to establish in academia. And then number 6 is important as well, like what factors might impact your ability to share your data. Funders as well as journals realize that if you're using things like secondary data under data use agreements or specific terms of use, you may not be able to share that, or if the data are sensitive in some nature. So a lot of the data management plan is just being really explicit about those plans. We do have a tool that we support here at Duke that can help you write a data management plan called the DMP tool. And I'll note, we've got links and stuff throughout these slides. We'll be providing them to you at the end of the workshop, so don't worry about that. But the DMP tool is nice because it essentially is a wizard that has templates for all the various different funding agencies' data management plan requirements. And it walks you through kind of what you should put in different sections. And then we've also linked out to relevant Duke resources that may support you as you write that plan. All right, so to move on to we're going to cover kind of these 4 big topics today around the foundational practices of storage and organization for data management, documentation and metadata, sharing and archiving your data, and then again, jumping into tools. All right, so again, at that foundational level is we want to make sure we don't inadvertently lose our data. We don't want to be like Brown Bear and have a copy of it on a USB drive under our desk. I know I always, anytime I teach this workshop, I feel like telling people to back up their data is pretty obvious, but it is something that sometimes, you know, it just is something that's not at the front of our minds, and inadvertent data loss can happen. So we want to have a good strategy in place to protect against that. And the first part of that is figuring out, well, where are you actually going to store your materials? So this is a nice chart that shows some of the Duke supported options for data storage and has some various different elements that you may want to consider when assessing those tools. So things like, does it have auto version control? Can you control access to different individuals? Is it approved for sensitive data? Can you collaborate outside of Duke? How much space? And then backups. A quick note about backups. We have this rule in the data management space called the 3-2-1 rule. And essentially what that says is to keep your important files safe, keep 3 copies of all files on at least 2 different storage media and 1 offsite or in the cloud. So again, even if you're using Box, you know, you really don't want that 1 Box copy that's just in the cloud to be your only copy because you don't want to have that single point of failure. And I did want to quickly mention, I'll pop over there really quickly. There's a nifty tool that if you're working with sensitive data that I would encourage you to check out that's been put together by OIT, where you can kind of go through the different classification levels of your data and put in information about, what is your storage need as far as, how much storage space you need. And then it will let you know which options are available, and you can learn more about those options, those storage options, and connect with the relevant group. So it's a nice tool if you are working with sensitive data. I would definitely encourage you to check it out. Okay, so moving on, once you figure out, okay, where I'm going to store my stuff, then you have to have a strategy for how you're going to organize your materials. And really, a lot of this is developing that organizational scheme that works for you. So not everybody has the same preferences for organization. I have this pro tip here to avoid heavily nested folders. It's kind of, again, a rule of thumb to not go beyond 4 levels in a certain project. But I will admit that I kind of like folder nesting. It's like a way that I make sense of the world. So if that's something that works for you, that's totally fine. I think the biggest thing to think about is just if you're working in a team-based structure or in collaborative research, making sure that the organizational scheme works for everybody and everybody can find what they're looking for when they're looking for it. That's the most important part of information retrieval and file management. It's generally suggested to keep everything from one project or study in a folder, and really determine who needs access to what files and when. If everybody doesn't need access to all the files and you can do more granular access controls, that can be a way to, again, protect against inadvertent changes to files or inadvertent data loss. And then finally, with your organizational scheme, you just want to document your structure. So what actually goes where? And then we often recommend to, especially if you're working on a team or collaboratively, to have a data management guru. So is there somebody on the team that really likes this organization stuff and, would be willing to be that point person to keep an eye on things and make sure things stay tidy, or bring it back to the group if you may need to reconsider your organizational structure if it's not working for the team. And then finally, it's always good to just, put it on the calendar to do some housekeeping of your files. Things can get pretty busy, pretty messy pretty quickly. I don't want to show you my desktop right now, but I usually try to build in that time to go through, do your filing, do your cleanup, to again, keep things just tidier. These are our important files, especially when we're dealing with our research data. So here's an example of kind of an organizational structure for a project. You may have, if you have 2 different sub-studies with different waves, encoding that data information can be really helpful in the folder names. And then oftentimes this is a structure that's recommended for reproducible research as well, is to keep your data separate from your code and programming files and separate from your documentation. If you're a Windows user and you kind of have tons of files and you need to get a handle on your folder structure and what files are where, there's a nifty command you can do that we have in these slides called the tree command that essentially just puts out a text file that will tell you all of the files, all of your and show your entire folder hierarchy. So that's useful. And I have heard from Mac users that there is something similar in Macs as well. I'm not a Mac user, so I'm not familiar with that, but I will at some point figure that out and get those added to these slides as well. Okay, so moving on with organization to one of our final topics, which I think is one of people's favorite topics, is file naming. So we want to make sure we have a strategy again in place so our files don't end up looking something like this. So from a high level, some of the best practices for file naming is that we want our file names to be descriptive. So we don't want generic file names like data or paper or project. But then they also need to be an appropriate length. So this is kind of a balancing act because really, really long file names can actually not be read into certain programs. So the program will stop reading the file if there's too many characters in it. And then it's just, figuring out your file naming convention and applying it consistently. And I would think some of this is kind of a critical thinking exercise where you want to think about, well, what are those key elements in this file that differentiate it from other files that I'll be generating throughout my project? And so, some things you might want to encode in your file name are things like a project acronym, if there's a location element to your data, if there's a time element to your data, if there's some other numerical numbering element to your data, or if you're working collaboratively. I know many of us, have done that, where you put your initials in a file name, things of that nature. But really, it's going to be very dependent upon your project, what elements make the most sense for your file names. Some other general tips for file names, and a lot of this is about making file names machine actionable. So generally, you only want file names to include letters, numbers, and underscores or dashes. So you don't want to use special characters, because again, special characters can mean specific things to specific programs. And you also don't want to use spaces. Instead, use dashes, underscores, or camel case. So a lot of this, again, is making sure that your file will be able to be read out into any different program or computational environment. Again, noting not all systems are case sensitive. And then you want to have a strategy for versioning. I know many of us have probably just done the really manual versioning of appending V1, V2, V3. If that's going to work for your process, then that is totally fine. You just want to establish that's going to be what you do at the beginning. Or as I showed in the storage table, some storage options have some built-in versioning, such as Box. And that can be sufficient, where you can at least roll back to those previous versions. And we're also going to have a presentation though later today on Git and GitHub, which is, that much more automated version control system that's going to be a much more robust versioning strategy. And then for dates, if you do encode dates in your file names, which can also be a very effective versioning technique. There's an actual ISO standard for how to structure your dates, and it's year, month, day. And a lot of that is actually really great because it helps things order sequentially if you have a date element in your file names. And so again, a big part of this is just writing down the different elements, establishing your convention, and then applying it consistently. Another kind of rule of thumb is ideally you want to be able to take your files out of your folder structure and still understand what they're all about. So you don't want your folder structure to be conveying too many pieces of meaning about your file. So you might think, well, it's in this hierarchy, so I know that it's part of this project, and it's part of this experiment, right? And this sample, like looking at our example here at the bottom, but really you want to be able to pick that file up out of that hierarchy and still understand essentially what it's about. And if you are in that place of like, well, I'm in a new project and I want to really figure out my file naming convention, some of our colleagues at Caltech put together a really nice worksheet to help you kind of walk through these mental steps of developing a file naming convention. If you're in a project though, where you're like, well, I've already got tons of files that are named a certain way and I want to rename them, there's also some bulk renaming tools out there that you can use. Bulk Renamer is one of them. There's PS Renamer is another one. So again, there's tools out there to help if you are in a situation of wanting to rename files in bulk. All right, so final kind of word on files. And we'd already mentioned this, right, where research data management is somewhat about future-proofing your materials. So in many ways, if we want to make our materials both available to others, as well as make sure we can open them into the future, it's best to use what can be called like preservation-friendly formats. So these are formats that are often non-proprietary, and they're open and documented standards, and they have standard representation and encoding of the data as well. So good example here that I can use from my background in the social sciences is I've worked with things like Stata and SPSS, and those are great analysis tools for statistical analyses. But if I want to make sure I can still open my own data in 5 or 10 years from now, or if I want to share it with Jen, it would be best if I exported it in something like a CSV file or a plain text file, because then I know she could take that and work with it in any different program. So again, going back to our example with our bear example, not having access to cytosynth was a huge deal. So we want to make sure that our data are not necessarily directly tied to a proprietary software system. That's not to say that you can't have that analysis version, but I would just always recommend you create a derivative in one of those more open standard copies. And then final tip from me is to always keep your raw original files. So you always want to be able to go back to that raw original one that's unmodified. And one kind of rule of thumb there is that you can make it read only. So like zip it up, make it read only, and don't ever touch it again. So you can always get back to that kind of original provenance trail of your research workflow. Okay, I've been talking for a while, so now we're going to do a really quick exercise, just do a mental check on organization and file naming. So what I'm going to ask you to do is just look at this mess of files and spend a minute thinking about what have they done wrong, what good practices that I just talked about that they not follow, so what's wrong, and then how might you organize these to make them easier to kind of approach from a information retrieval perspective. So again, I'll give you just a minute and then we'll ask for a couple volunteers to either speak up or to share some thoughts in the chat.
So document all the things. I mean, this is a funny slide. And if you happen to know about the cartoonist, I think her name's Ali Barash. She had some pretty hysterical stuff on hyperbole and a half. But I think the biggest point about documentation here is if you saw with Brown Bear continually insisting that the information that Panda needed was going to be in the article. Not really. The data in the article, you know, it's summarized, it's explained in narrative form. You don't have variables and values put in very clear ways. And that's kind of what we're talking about here, as well as some other important details that you might need to document. So when we look at documentation, it can be done in a lot of different ways and at varying levels throughout the project. The most granular documentation, that's at the data file level. And this is where you define your variables, your values, your measurements, missing data, all that nitty-gritty stuff. The next level is the data set or study level. This is where you define your methodology, explain relationships between data files, perhaps address your analysis approach, and any other important contextual details. And then finally, there's the top level, which is the administrative level. So this is where if you have a grant, you would document that information, how you plan to name and organize your files. If you have a team who has different roles and responsibilities and what are they supposed to be doing. But you can see here in this table that there are a number of different ways that documentation can be presented. All of it's important for your own data management, as well as for your plan to share your data more broadly with the research community. In some ways, I also look at the administrative level documentation. Someone else also is like a data management plan. It's a living document that this is how I'm going to manage and organize my project. I will revise and change it as needed. And that's absolutely true. And I think a lot of the funding agencies, that's how they're wanting people to start approaching data management plans rather than just a requirement. But as you can see, you know, with the data level, you might already be familiar with some of these, and we'll talk about more in detail here. But code books, data dictionaries, annotated instruments, meaning like survey instruments. At the study level, sometimes it's in the code book or a user guide. It could be in a data narrative. It could even just be in a README file. And frankly, README files, they're the most flexible because they can be anything, nice, simple text file. And then at the administrative level, kind of keeping together all of that information about grants, documents, like I said, the data management plan, analysis plan, and even your IRB protocol as well, because if you make certain changes to your project and you're working with human participants, you might also need to amend your IRB protocol. So as I mentioned, README, really flexible. This is an example of that. And this is one that's basically an example of those administrative details. They're great because they can be adapted for really any kind of data. They're not wedded to any particular discipline type or data type. Our colleagues at Cornell actually have a very informative guide, so we didn't need to recreate our own, and a downloadable template that can help you how to write a README file about the different aspects of your project. They have it all the way from administrative level down to that the data file level. So this is an example of a code book. Code books are often used with quantitative data that contain coded values. So code books are a great way also to determine if a data set is appropriate for secondary use because they typically provide useful summary statistics such as frequencies, percentage of valid responses, et cetera. The Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, which is a long-standing 60-plus-year-old social sciences archive, they have an extensive guide that you can consult about how to build a good codebook for your own work. And I should mention, I think Sophia might have, but if she didn't or I missed it, all these links and all these helpful little hints and tips we have in this presentation, you're going to get a copy of that at the end of the workshop. So don't worry about hurried jotting down notes. You will get this and be able to refer back to it. So a data dictionary is a central document that defines properties of data elements. So for example, the appropriate units and the allowed values, whether 0 is valid, and the meaning of blank or null data. While this information could be handled in something like a README for a specific data set, sometimes there are multiple data sets that point to a single data dictionary, and this can enforce or at least encourage standardization across different files. So the particular example we have here is from NASA, and it's the Planetary Data System Data Dictionary, and it's the entry for the field aperture. So in a lot of ways, a data dictionary can be very similar to a code book, but I like to think of it as sometimes as it's the many-to-one relationship where you can have all different kinds of files that follow that same dictionary. So now looking at code, when working to document code, you might want to consider using something like Jupyter, which allows you to create interactive notebooks where you can comment in between chunks of code and then run them. The notebooks are very dynamic and they can be used to show data visualization and statistical modeling, among other things. It is open source software and supports over 40 programming languages, including Python and R. We do have folks in CDVS who are familiar with using Jupyter. So if you'd like to learn more about that, please feel free to contact our department. So if Jupyter notebooks are more than you really want to deal with, you can still add documentation about and comments within your code to ensure that other users can understand what packages are needed, hierarchical dependencies there are, and what the command lines themselves actually perform. In many ways, it can actually serve as documentation for the data itself, especially if it's very heavily code-based. So this is actually code from the Schmid lab in Duke Biology, and they shared it in a GitHub repository. John's going to be talking about GitHub later on and doing some demonstrations. It's a very useful tool for sharing progress on code development, as well as for collaboration. So there is a specific README file actually for the code file that specifies the software and packages required for it to run. That's the first thing you usually see when you go to a GitHub project page. So metadata. Metadata is a term you'll hear used in lots of different contexts, primarily because its definition is to provide data about data. With that being said, you could potentially consider all types of documentation to be metadata. However, what we often mean in the repositories and archives world when we talk about metadata is that it's the information surrounding a data object to make it more discoverable and interoperable. Think about how you search the library's catalog or a particular database. Those fields are standardized in order to return the most relevant results based on how you search. Standardized or structured metadata is typically written in XML because it allows people to define their own fields. XML is very flexible. As a result, different disciplines often develop their own metadata schemas in order to better capture and represent information that is specific to that field using common terminology and information structure. So the example that we have here, and I'm not sure how easy it is to see because it is quite small, is an example from computational neuroscience, and it's called NeuroML. One thing to note about disciplinary metadata is it can disappear, unfortunately, if the user community stops supporting it. The link at the bottom of this slide is actually to a GitHub repository of disciplinary standards that's maintained by the Research Data Alliance, which is a formal international research data professionals organization, so they're doing their best to keep that up to date. If you are using a formal schema, meta indexes can harvest the metadata and make your materials findable across different search interfaces. For example, Data1, which is the data observation network for Earth, is one such network of tons of repositories. If you want to assign formal metadata to your work, there also are often tools that can make it much easier to adapt a schema to your needs. So to sum up a bit on documentation and metadata, there's essentially I would say, a low to high barrier for adoption. A README is the simplest and most flexible form of documentation. It's fairly uncomplicated, but of course it does have its limitations. If you have more complex data, this is where more structured documentation such as code books, data dictionaries, protocols, and the like provide necessary contextual detail for working with the files. And finally, a formal metadata schema has its advantages in that the structured documentation makes it more discoverable, through different harvest search engines and things like that, but it also makes it interoperable, sometimes going across different data sets. So now we're going to talk a little bit about sharing and archiving, unless anybody's got documentation questions. Good to go. All right, so talking about sharing and archiving. So this is the big thing with the OSTP memo, as well as with what NIH is enacting this upcoming spring. Basically, what does it mean to formally share data? I mean, in the past, data sharing could happen in many different ways. And basically, that could be by request a lot of the time, direct peer-to-peer through a personal project website, or as supplementary materials with an article. But at this point, what they're asking for is formal data publishing, which basically this type of data sharing supports reproducibility of results. And the data are in a form where they can actually be used for secondary analysis. They aren't static, so that they follow community best practices for data sharing and stewardship. So personal websites don't really offer preservation. They're only up as long as your department supports it, or your department IT supports it. Repositories are meant to hold data for the long term. And also, having supplementary materials is wonderful to help explain the context of your journal article. But a lot of these journals are saying, no, we want the actual data that made these supplementary figures and things like that to be available for people to reproduce what you did. So what are people doing right now when it comes to sharing or publishing data? I think with some of the changes coming, that we talked about earlier, NIH and OSTP, we're going to see repository use start to eclipse some of the other methods, just because it's being hammered so hard by the US government and by the federal agencies. But you'll see right now, or at least this was 2015, so it's a little dated, but at the time, again, that direct contact was more often than not. But it was good to see that repositories was still up there. Journals are also tending to offload a lot of this stuff because they realized that storage started to get very expensive. So you're not going to see journals as much host things as they used to. So how do you publish your data? We recommend following this decision tree when you're trying to figure this out, because the repository complex, the repository landscape is very complex. And I was talking about this in an earlier NIH workshop, that you might get to a point where you have fear of too many options. And I don't think that's really going to get any better. I think there's always going to be too many options, but this kind of helps you narrow things down. Number one, did your funder specify where your data needs to go? Then that's where it should go. Did your journal specify where it should go? If they did, that's where it should go. If neither one of those are an option that's available, then you might want to look into your particular scholarship area. Is there a discipline-specific repository or data type repository that a lot of people in your field would go to find this kind of data? If that's the case, we would recommend going with that, because they often do have those disciplinary metadata standards and other things that are more specialized to particular fields or data types. If that's not an option, then you could look at something that's more local, that at least provides data curation. We offer that here with the Duke Research Data Repository, where we can take data from any discipline, and we do provide curatorial services. And finally, if you have really no other options and you need a really quick turnaround, there are general repositories out there. They're typically self-serve and provide limited to no assistance. And you really have to rely on yourself to make sure that the data you're putting out there is a complete package. So one other thing as we start talking about data sharing is that we are aware, and I think the government's aware, everybody's aware, that not all data can just be out there for anybody to just grab. The goal is to really have things as open as possible, but understanding that sometimes they need to be closed as necessary in order to protect participants' confidentiality, to protect protected locations, things like that, just to make sure that, there's a balance there. I am offering a workshop on working with human participants data later this fall. I think it's in October 11th, I think, but talking about some of this and what goes into that. And we aren't offering it this semester, but we do have a recording of our ethics workshop, which talks about some of this as well. So why use a repository that is the best fit for your data? Well, that's because funders and journal publishers are all adopting something called the FAIR Guiding Principles as the gold standard for published data. Repositories can offer services that ensure that your work is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So basically, what does that mean? So when you want something to be findable, you want it to have a persistent identifier, such as a DOI or an ARC, and using standardized descriptive metadata so things can be discovered and found easily. They also make it accessible, and then it provides end users with the terms and conditions for use of that data. They make it interoperable through standardized metadata, as well as recommending open, non-proprietary formats for long-term preservation and access. So like Sophia said, it's great if you have an analysis-ready version, but we can't always rely on the fact that Cytosynth is going to be there forever. And finally, they make data reusable through some level of data curation and quality review, again, to make sure that the package is as complete as possible. So we do have our research data repository program here at Duke. Sophia and I are both curators, and we do belong to a larger network of expert curators. I'm not even sure how many institutions there are at this point. When we started, I think there were about 10. Now there might be 13, 14. But basically, it's called the Data Curation Network, and we tend to share our expertise based on different subject areas by cross-curating data sets from our repositories. We also provide access to the following platforms on this slide here for free, in that we've paid for their use to some level in advance. Some you might have some added fees, but this includes ICPSR, which I talked about earlier, Vivly, which is a general clinical research data archive, the qualitative data repository, and the general repository and workflow tool called the Open Science Framework. The OSF is actually going to be part of our tool tour later on. So again, to kind of sum up some of the importance about using repositories and why funders and journal publishers are pushing this so much, is that putting your data in a repository, they found that articles with a link to the underlying data in a repository have a 25% higher citation impact. If you are going to remain in academia, you know that this is a really important thing. And of course, you know, you're doing good work anyway. You want people to see it and find it and get excited about it. So here are two examples of data citations that are included with data records in our research data repository. Most repositories will provide a citation with a dataset record for end users to apply, as well as advocating for proper citation of data sets. Even if somebody applies a copyright type permission where it's out in the public domain, the norm is still to cite the source always, just like you would cite a public data resource that you used. You still want people to find the sources of information for your research. So we're about ready to start our tool session, but we wanted to take a break first so that people could, like Sophia said, get more coffee, stretch your legs. If anybody has any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them in the interim. If not, then I would say please be back at about 3 o'clock.
All right, everyone, it is 3 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I want to thank Kelsey Smith for being here with us today to present on LabArchives. So I'll let her kind of introduce her role and take us through a tour of LabArchives and how that can help with data management. Thanks, Kelsey.
Thanks, Sophia. I appreciate it. My name's Kelsey. I work at the Assist Office. We're part of the Office of Scientific Integrity. So in my role there, I help support the LabArchives electronic lab notebook. So mostly a lot of our questions get sent to support, but I can help interface with local issues. And also I've been working on doing some support for teams and individuals looking to transfer their data or transition their teams new projects or whatever they're working on into an electronic lab notebook system. So every team is different and has different needs, and I've kind of been learning what those different needs kind of group into, and would be happy to meet with anyone here. Feel free to reach out to me. There's also some contact information at the end you could access as well. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. So LabArchives is an electronic lab notebook system. It's a web-based application, so it can store data, including that metadata that we were talking about earlier that was so important. But it's centrally accessible and it has an electronic format, so you are able to export that, which I'll hopefully be able to show you here in a minute. But it looks kind of like you'd expect from Evernote or OneNote. You have notebooks, folders, and pages just like this. And the real appeal here is that those README files that we were talking about earlier can actually be stored alongside the data files, where the version controlling is also kept very well, which we'll talk about. So there's also powerful integrations that are built in, which makes this a little bit better than a notepad file or a README file within a file folder system. And on top of all of that, it is free through Duke already. So you have access to those premium features, unlimited file storage, and some other perks we'll talk about in a second. So electronic record keeping in general is, of course, has many advantages over paper record keeping. This is of interest to anyone trying to move away from that paper system. One of the biggest things that comes up for people in this position is the searchability. Even having things just in a Dropbox or a departmental drive, we find that searching for files, specific instances or notes can be kind of difficult, and that's something that LabArchives does very well. It will actually search through not only file names, but also the text of files that are under 250 megabytes. So that's in Word documents or PowerPoint or Excel documents as well. You're also able to tag all of those as another layer of metadata. There's some great collaborative tools that are built in as well. As for accessibility, data are available from anywhere with an internet location. They do also have a mobile app, so you're able to access that from your phone, which is really handy for uploading pictures of scribbled post-it notes that some of us accumulate on our desks all the time. There's also secure backups of this in multiple locations, so it actually does use a box integration through Duke. It doesn't take up your personal storage, but we do have unlimited access for that. But it is securely stored behind your single sign-on, so you don't have to worry about people happening across that you don't want to see your data, but you are able, you can see down here, to share with various colleagues and collaborators, even ones from other institutions. The documentation is also excellent within LabArchives, so there's excellent versioning control, not only for individual entries in LabArchives, but also for any changes to files that are stored within the notebook that can be changed through integrations, which I'll talk about in just a second. And on top of being built into this online platform, there's also the ability to export to back up those notebooks using an HTML export or a PDF export. The PDF export, I think, is really great. It includes a hyperlinked table of contents. It's automatically generated, and it actually includes links to all of the files that are in the notebook. So you can actually open the latest version as long as you have an internet connection, even though the PDF is kind of a snapshot in time. So some other perks of LabArchives, one of the reasons why it was chosen to be our institutionally supported lab notebook. So it's flexible user roles and sharing. So we'll look at a chart in a second to kind of look at what the differences in all of those are, but you have a lot of control down to the entry, the page in the notebook, who you want to be able to see it. So, you know, maybe you have a notebook that you want to share with some very well-intentioned undergraduate students you can set it up so that they can view that notebook without being able to make changes. But nothing is permanent, so you can always get them access later. Another interesting perk from LabArchives is the folder monitor automatic uploads. This is a separate program that you download from LabArchives and set up on your computer that can watch folders on your desktop and upload any new files to specific pages within your notebook. So this is great if you have a machine in your lab that's going to spit out a report after hours and you'd like to take a look at it, or you want to have those raw files backed up somewhere automatically. You can throw it in a folder on your desktop and have that program running in the background, and it'll grab it and upload it automatically, and then start doing version control and anything that happens to it in the notebook. Some of these program integrations, I've shown these off to the right-hand side here. This is not every program, but when we're talking about program integrations here, it's not to say that only these types of files can be stored in the notebook. LabArchives can actually store any type of file, but these types of integrations over here actually allow you to open those files within their native program and make any changes there. working within the native program, and then you can save it back to the notebook, oftentimes without even having to log into the notebook through the web service. So that's really handy. I find that that barrier of having to log into the notebook and go through single sign-on can be kind of prohibitive to some people. Understandably, that's an extra step nobody really wants to deal with, but if you're just going to open up through Microsoft Office, it actually adds it to the open dialog box. You can just open from LabArchives, choose the page and the file, and edit it right from there. It'll save straight back to the notebook, immediately available to anyone else who has access to it. I do want to point out that the red cap one here I included because I'm very excited that this is coming out, but it isn't quite ready yet. LabArchives hasn't quite released it, but it's nearly ready and would allow posting reports from REDCap directly into the notebook. This is something that we're working on developing with relationship to PHI, which I'll talk about in a second. I do want to mention customizable widgets. These are HTML code you can put into the notebook to do basically anything you want, checklists, specific forms. I've seen calendar widgets, all kinds of opportunities there. So you can work with LabArchives if there's something in particular that you're trying to build. And this can be a great way to create templates so that you don't have to type in all of that metadata for every experiment you're doing every time. As I mentioned, all types of files can be stored in LabArchives. The only caveats there are the size. They need to be less than 15 gigabytes. You can store as many files as you want, up to 15 gigabytes, but they cannot exceed 15 gigabytes. So if they are, you can link out to them. If they're on, or put the file path so that you can talk about them, but just can't go over that. They won't upload. The other limitation we'll talk about in a minute that I want to mention multiple times because it's very important is that protected health information cannot currently go in the notebook. This is something that we're talking about right now. De-identified data is fine. Project information, project planning, all of that stuff is fine in the notebook, just not the protected health information itself. So that's another caveat. This is just a quick chart to show you the different sharing roles that are available. It's a little complicated, but the big take-home message there is that everything is reversible. So you can go ahead and start playing around in LabArchives, and if you want to transfer ownership to your principal investigator later, that's possible. Or if you want to keep that, we would prefer principal investigators have the primary ownership of the notebook moving forward. But you can see that you can have as many administrators which have all the same roles as you'd like. So that's something to keep in mind too. Here's that piece I mentioned earlier. As long as this dialogue or this image is up in the upper left-hand corner that says no PHI, please respect that. It's very important. Many institutions do allow it into the notebook, so we're hopeful that we'll be able to work something out with that soon. But in the meantime, just link out to any of your PHI or describe the location of that data instead of putting it into the notebook for now. And I know we're coming up on time here, so I just want to have one more slide to show you how to sign in. This process has gotten a little bit easier since I made this slide, but the take-home message is you do want to make sure you sign in through Duke University so that you get those premium features. If you happen to have an account already, you can link them through your settings page. I'm happy to help with that. Please reach out if you're having any trouble. But I also want to point out that you can sign in through My Research Home. So in this case, you would have already gone in through your single sign-on. So you can actually just skip right ahead to your notebook. You will have to do some setup if it's your first time. But the same goes for the LabArchives mobile app. There's a sign in with institution button there that will ensure that you sign in with the right credentials to get access to those premium features. Included in the slide deck that you will all have access to are some important contact pieces of information. You can reach out to us directly, or you can go to this webpage here to access a Qualtrics link to set up a consultation. I also do office hours every Wednesday from noon to 1, which we've just missed today, but you're always welcome to stop by. And do notice that when you open your first LabArchives notebook, you will automatically be added to the institutional support notebook, which also has many useful links in it. With that, I'm happy to take any questions or hand it off to John, I think, right?
Thanks, Kelsey. Yeah,
Yeah.
any questions on LabArchives? And we'll have time for questions at the end as well. I'm not seeing anything. So yeah, we'll pass it over to John Little to tell us a little bit about Git and GitHub. John, you're muted.
Let me unmute first and then start to share a screen. And this screen, the distribution packet that Sophia's going to hand out or may have mentioned includes a link to this slide deck. This is not my slide deck, but it's really well done. And so I'm going to use it again and give Alice Bartlett all the credit. She did a presentation on this back in 2016. But let me also not bury the lead. Let me just give you sort of 3 points about what Git and GitHub are. And as I talk, I'll point out that Git and GitHub are not the same thing, but they're often used simultaneously. Git is used to manage and track and record the evolution of a project. Really any kind of project, some folder on your local file system. So all the artifacts of that project and the evolution and how it changes over time can be managed by Git. GitHub can be used for collaboration with others in a variety of ways, and the combination of those two tools really can be used to distribute files, projects, artifacts, just to push them all over the world in whatever way you see fit. So with that summary, let me go straight into these slides by Alice Bartlett and give you kind of an overview. Alice, I have never met. She did this presentation back in 2016. I don't even know where, but I assume somewhere in the UK. She is a senior developer, a web developer working at the Financial Times, which is a news source, right? But she's developing the website for the news source. So in many ways, her use case for using Git and GitHub is a publication-based use case, which I think bears a lot of similarity to use case of many people in the academy, which you're driving publication based on some kind of project and resources and research and data and oftentimes code as well. So let's just dive right into it. I'm going to not use all of the slides, but I'll show several of them. The prompt is that Alice is suggesting that things are just better when designers are involved, and that is Alice. She's a designer, a web designer. And then the question she asks is, what tools can you not live without that designers don't have, right? So something that's not fit specifically within the design or the publication domain, but that she uses constantly. And her answer is that she uses Git. All right. And then she goes on, and I'll tell you, she goes on to explain what is Git and what is GitHub. She starts off by quoting this professor who I can't read his name because of my screen on Tom Stewart, whose definition of Git is really good. He says Git is an application that runs on your computer. It's like a web browser. It's like a word processor. And while that is definitely technically true, I personally sort of take issue with that because word processors and web browsers are actually really easy to use. And for the most part, people don't really need a lot of training in how these tools work. You can go to training to leverage all of their features, but they're really easy to use. Git, on the other hand, actually suffers from a lack of good usable user interface design. And there's a reason why people suffer through this. And one of those reasons is it's so extensible, and it's also free and open source, and it's also bulletproof that you only have to use the parts that are relevant to your project. But again, backing off a little bit from Tom Stewart's definition, what I always say is Git is a little bit more like an operating system utility, but it is technically absolutely an application, something that you load on your local system. And what does it do? Well, it helps you get your work done. And as I said, it's kind of unfriendly, and there's a reason why it's unfriendly. And we'll see if this next slide, no, we'll get there. There's one slide that I'll go over real quickly. But this is kind of what Git looks like. And in its sort of raw form, it's a command line driven tool, but there are clients that you can apply on top of Git so that you never have to really see these commands. I myself use R and RStudio a lot, and it integrates really well with R. There are other free clients that you can use to manage and orchestrate Git. But what you can see is that, there's a series of Git commands: Git checkout, Git pull origin master, Git branch. We'll talk about those things. Those things are actually quite simple when you really start to dig into them, and we're going to talk about them a little bit here. They are, however, jargon laden, and so I want to demystify some of that. There's the reason why Git is kind of hard to use. It's that guy right there. His name is Linus Torvalds. I'm going to skip beyond that screen because I don't like looking at it. Linus Torvalds is responsible, or a primary driver, often noted for being perhaps the father of Linux, which is the world's really most successful distributed project-oriented operating system, right? It's free. And what Linus knew was that he needed a bulletproof, extensible, free tool that could deal with collaboration from across the globe, multiple time zones, multiple spoken languages, written languages. I don't know much about the details of what kind of computer languages are used. There may be multiples, there probably are. But that's why Linus designed Git, but he didn't put a lot of effort into the user interface, and nonetheless, people continue to use it. So I'm going to give you 5 explanations of why people use it and how they use it, and hopefully some of that will be interesting to you. Thing 1 is Git lets you tell the story of your project. Okay, so the evolution of your project as it evolves. Git will essentially take a snapshot of all of the files in a folder. So PDF documents, Word documents, sound files, video files, any kind of file you can store on your local operating system. Git, README files that we were discussing. Git will timestamp the state of your project at any given time. And that folder or directory on your file system then is also known as a Git repository, which we use the term repo for short. Anytime you change the files, the state of the files in that repository, you do what's called a commit, right? So that's actively taking notice of the fact that the files change. That's the sort of main user effort, is just noting that you are going to keep track of how your file system changes and offer oftentimes minimal, but sometimes extensive explanation as to how and why things are changing. You'll see more in a minute. All right, so the typical easy way to explain this is if you look at this set of files, these are all graphic image files used in some website, they're logos, and you can see that whoever's using these file names is using the file name mechanism to identify the evolution of how things change, right? You can see that first there was a logo file, then there was a second logo file, then there's Monica feedback, then you have final, and then Murphy's law of anything that you name final, you're not really done, and then you have final -1. And we've all done this, and what we all know is that it works fine up until a point, but it doesn't really scale all that well. And we've all looked at a file folder that has this kind of mechanism, maybe separated by time. Maybe we look at it 3 months later, and we're kind of confused. Which file am I supposed to be looking at? And that's one of the things that gets solved, right? So you no longer have 5 different versions, the evolution of the logo, 5 different versions of that file. You have 1, right? So you have logo 1, and you make a commit to the change to add that to the timeline. And then as you make a change, you'll notice instead of calling it logo 2, you just commit it again and you explain this is the change. It's still called logo. Same thing, 3rd change, still called logo. And you can go back and look at the timeline and see how and why that changed. Okay. All right. So when you commit, some information is saved along the way. Most of that information is the who and the when. That's the automatic stuff that happens all the time. You can also put in some why messages, and the why messages are really up to you. But that whole thing is called a commit message. Right. So there's an example of a commit message. Somebody wrote, this doesn't have the who and the when, but it has the why. They're explicitly noting that they changed some links because they did some kind of user study and people weren't noticing things. So they have that information in the commit message. And then here's a better example of how a commit message works. You can see the column along the right, 5 different versions of the file. And the left is the commit message. So it's the who, it's Alice, it's the when, and some both brief and more extensive messaging about how the file changed. And you can see that the file changes over time, and there are different commit messages. We take a slightly different view at how a project might change rather than just a file. We can look at this horizontal line with the dots. And this is a representation of time. Each one of those dots represents a commit, right? And so you can see below the horizontal line, there are some arrows pointing to individual commits, identifying the time when the commit was done, and a very brief message. So you can see how that kind of information gets stored. All right, at this point, we've learned at least two things. We've learned what is a repository and what is a commit. But I keep telling you that you can travel back in time. You can look back at your project, and that's essentially what Git allows you to do, is it lets you look at the incremental evolutionary changes of your project at any point in time. And this can come in really handy, both when you're sharing your project at the end, or if anybody asks you, how did you do this one step that I don't see documented anywhere? You can turn back and expose that. Git allows you to do all of that. Store the whole history of your project. It does that. This is kind of a minor point, but it does that by identifying each commit with something called a hash. I will tell you that less than 1% of the time have I ever needed to address a hash number. But just so you know, that's kind of how it works. Everything gets a unique number. And for the most part, you don't even have to string out the whole number. You can just use about the first 4 or 5 or the last 4 or 5 alphanumeric string elements there. And that uniquely identifies the hash. So what we're going to do here is we're going to travel back in time or use an example. You can notice here that if we travel back 6 steps in our history, that the message that goes along with that hash is deleted an icon, right? Deleted play icon. Somebody decided that icon was no longer relevant. The setup that I'm going to offer to you is, imagine that you were on this project team and you noticed some 5 commits later that icon was gone, but you really like that icon for whatever reason. However, it's been deleted. Now, in a lot of cases, like for example, if you're using something like Box, it may be hard to ever retrieve that, but in Git, it's not hard. Even though that deleted file disappears from the current state of your project, you can roll back and still retrieve it. You do that by what's called a checkout, right? So you check out a commit using a hash, and then you roll back and you look at that, and it sort of basically blocks the future, presenting you only the state of that project in that file, in that folder. Sorry, not in the file, but in the folder. What is the state of the folder for, what is that date? May 20th, 2016. And then you could, I don't know, you could do a number of things. You could pull that file out and bring it back forward. You could, put it on your local file system in a different place because you really liked it. Any number of things. The point is that you can roll back seeing that entire project history. Okay, so we've learned 2 more terms, hash and checkout. Hash being that ID and checkout being the way to go back to each one of those IDs in time. And then here's a really huge thing. Git helps you experiment with things. Now, one of the ways that I use Git to experiment is I teach a lot of workshops on R. And every semester I'll go in and I'll look at my Git repository of my R materials, and I'll create some experiments of how do I want to change this. But I don't want to change or delete or alter what I've done in the past. And Git helps me with that. Another scenario might be, imagine you've finished a document that you're going to hand in either to a professor or to a thesis review panel or to a journal, whatever. You've got it just finished perfectly the way you want. And now you maybe have a little breathing room and a little opportunity to be creative and think of other ways that you could have presented the work, but maybe you're just too afraid to alter what you're going to hand in tomorrow. With Git, you don't have to be afraid, because it has this feature called branching, where you create exact copies of that commit. And then you can check out different branches and work on different branches. Then you can even alter them and merge them back in. I'll show you some examples. So in Git terminology, the main branch has typically been called master. Actually, in the last 2 years, that terminology has changed to be now generally referred to as main. So you may hear me use the word main, but in these slides, it's master. So we have this master branch, and then we're going to create a new branch, and we're going to call it add new styles, right? So in this particular scenario, it's a website, right? It's Alice Bartlett's website. So she's got a published website, but she wants to explore what happens if she changes the visual style of the website. So she creates a branch, she calls it add new styles, and she makes a series of changes. Now, the rest of the world is looking at the master commit. That's the one that's published. But depending on your permissions that Alice can probably grant to you, you could look at the evolution of the changes leading up to the last change, the last commit, that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th commit under add new styles. Or it may be invisible to you, but those changes are tracked. And then not only that, but you could make yet another branch, looks like in this case, Alice did, called Wild Experiment. And let's just say that that time she used really, loud pink colors because she was just kind of having fun with it. But she never had any real idea that she would actually publish the Wild Experiment. So now I've got 3 different iterations of my project, but the pristine published version still exists, and that's what everybody's looking at. Then if I wanted to, I could merge the add new styles series of changes back into the master main timeline, and Git is just going to, with one command, Git is just going to automatically fill in that timeline. And now in your whole history, which still exists, you can see how there have been some experimentations, how the experimentations have been merged back into the main timeline. And there's that pink branch there that's kind of orphaned. You can delete these orphans if you want to. You can delete the branches. It sort of depends on if you really want to prune your timeline. But the easiest thing to do is leave it be because it tells the whole story. And then you don't really have to do anything special to make that become part of your main timeline other than to say merge. So we've learned 2 more words. We've learned branching and we've learned merging. Now, thing 4 and thing 5 really are, in my mind, are kind of related, which is this idea of backups and remotes, as well as an idea of collaboration. I'll mostly cover that in this next bit here. Git helps you back up your work. Let's see. So a lot of people are used to using Box. One of the things that Box does, by the way, is it does version control of a single file. But if you wanted to find the state of the project for all of the files for that project back to a specific date, it's much harder to do. Not hard at all to do in Git. So we have this idea of remotes, and remotes are yet another kind of branch of your Git repository, and you push it up into the cloud. And there are several examples of remotes. There's GitHub, GitLab, Bitbucket. They're almost all free. Duke runs a local instance of GitLab, so that's yet another version. You can push your Git project into all of these remotes if you want to, but most people just use one. So the first thing you do is you clone that remote. For example, let's say that I manage this remote and it's up there for my project team to collaborate on. So I'm going to introduce this guy, Martin. He's going to clone from the cloud, from GitHub, and have the exact same commit history now locally on his local file system. And then we're going to bring in this character, Lucy, and Lucy's going to clone it, and everybody's up to date. We all have the exact same project. And fortuitously, that means the project now exists in 3 distinct locations. So in the library and the electronic world, we often talk about the fact that there are 2 kinds of people in the world: those who have lost data and those who will. Right? That is sort of less the case now because there's so many more systems that prevent that data loss. But one of the things we know is that the more copies you have of your project, the less likely you're going to suffer a devastating loss. And one of the things Git does is, in collaboration with GitHub, is it allows you to have these multiple copies. All right, so here's what happens. Lucy comes in and she fixes some kind of tinting, the coloring of something. So she makes that commit. And then she's going to push it back up to the remote, right? That's called a push. And now Lucy and the remote are up to date, but Martin is one behind. So it's a very simple operation in this kind of collaboration. Martin goes up to his computer and he does what's called a pull. And as soon as that pull happens, then all 3 copies are synchronized, right? And Git has a way to manage conflicts. So the larger your team, the more likely you're going to have conflicts. Or if you're just a solo person, I have a habit of working on one computer at work and a different computer at home. And so I push and pull to myself all the time. And sometimes I, kind of make a mistake, and Git will tell me that there's a conflict that I can resolve. So that's an example of both having multiple copies of your project as well as the kind of collaboration that you can do. And I think that's everything I wanted to tell you about Git and GitHub. I am offering with Sophia a workshop on specifically how to use Git with R later in the semester. If there are any questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. Just need to figure out how to stop sharing. Oh, well.
I can try to just see if I can take over, John.
Oh, there's the, sorry, the bright red button right in front of me that said stop
Okay.
sharing. I just couldn't see the forest through the trees. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much for that great. I love those slides. I think that they're a really great explanation of how Git works in a relatively straightforward way. As you say, it can be a bit complex. So I am up now to finish up with our last tool, the OSF. Let me also get my slides going. Okay, can you guys see my screen? I'm assuming yes. Okay. So the last tool we're going to talk about is OSF. It used to stand for Open Science Framework, but I think they're now just calling it OSF to be more inclusive of anyone who across the disciplines. So this is a project management tool that, again, can support various different aspects of research collaboration. It also integrates with some other tools like LabArchives, which Kelsey showed us. And it's really aimed at supporting reproducibility and transparency in research through the open sharing of research materials. So here at Duke, we do pay for a membership. And so that means that we have both a landing page or a Duke instance where you can highlight and affiliate your projects with Duke, and you have the single sign-on via Shibboleth to make access easier. A couple quick things just on storage allocations. So again, they kind of have this structure where you can keep projects private, but if you keep them private, you only get 5 gigs of storage, whereas if you make them public, you get 50 gigs of storage. And again, this is how they're trying to incentivize and really encourage that open research practices and making your projects openly accessible. Again, this is a platform that should not store any sensitive data in any way. Again, it's very much focused on making things open, so only materials that can be made openly accessible should be placed there. One of the other big things that OSF does that I'm going to really briefly show you all is they are one of the key groups that supports registering studies. So this idea of pre-registration, where you make your hypotheses and your research plan accessible prior to even collecting data to aid in research transparency and demonstrate the integrity of your research. So I'm primarily going to focus on projects, but I'll briefly show you also a pre-registration in the system. So I am actually going to do a live demonstration, so bear with me here. So again, as I mentioned, we do have kind of a Duke branded page. So if you end up sharing a project, then it would appear on this Duke branded page. So you can see we have quite an active OSF community that are using the tool. And then also you will see all of the registrations. And I haven't done the numbers lately, but I will say as an aside that the last time I heard from OSF, Duke was one of the institutions that had some of the highest numbers for registering studies. So I think that's really cool. We are really involved in this space, and I think it's a new practice in kind of the space of academia, but I think it's something that we're seeing increasing as we try to make our full kind of research process more transparent. So I'm going to go over here. So once you're logged in, you also have your own projects page. So this will have all of the projects that you've contributed to, whether they're public or private. Jen and I a while back set up a walkthrough project that kind of walks through how you can set up an OSF project. So essentially how an OSF project is structured is it has these overall project pages. When it comes to organization, one of the things that they support is what's called components. So essentially what a component is, it's like a little sub project, right? It has all the same features as the overall project, but this is the way that you can create some nesting and some different organization to your project. So again, I'm just going to kind of walk through some of the different elements we see here. The components is one of the big organizational pieces. And then you have your file pane, which is pretty similar to what you would see with lots of different storage platforms. They do have, as I said, OSF has its own local storage. But then it also, one of the things that I think is really great about it is the integrations. So it integrates with lots of different other storage platforms. So you can see here, we have linked a Box folder, Dropbox, Google Drive. You can link with GitHub. So really most of the big storage platforms, OneDrive, all of them are supported through integrations. And what's nice about this and how I've seen it used is, as we know, maybe if you're collaborating with a team, maybe you have some files over in Google Drive because you like the collaborative editing features there, but then you're doing your coding in GitHub, and maybe there's somebody who just really likes to use Box and has all of their stuff there. This is a way to kind of have that project umbrella where you can bring together all your materials in one space. And so I think that's really one of the biggest nice features of the OSF. A lot of different files do directly render in the tool. So here is Jen's dog, Franklin, just because there's no workshop that's complete without a gratuitous dog photo. Again, this tool doesn't have as robust of kind of editing within the tool as some other platforms like LabArchives or Box. It's more about the storage and then the ideally ultimate sharing and making public of materials. But they do have some built-in features around file management. So they do have some built-in versioning. So this one only has one version right now, but if I uploaded another picture of Franklin today, then it would have that various revision, and you can always go back and download the previous version. So it does have some nice built-in kind of basic automated versioning. A few of the other things it supports, kind of going back to some of our data management best practices we've discussed. So you do have recent activities. So you have a little bit of provenance information of kind of who has done what in the project over time. And for documentation, there is a built-in wiki. So this is, again, nice place where you can just put various different information about your project. And then you can have, wiki pages for each of the components as well. So you can kind of have that nesting of project information. And I have seen some research labs, use this for communicating out their standard operating procedures, and different types of documentation can be stored there. For discoverability and metadata, the primary metadata supported by OSF is just tags. So it's not really robust when it comes to that type of structured metadata, but you also do have information like your description, your license, which Jen touched upon, that's a big feature for repositories or platforms for sharing, is making sure you are clear on how people can or cannot use your materials. So you have that license. And then they have the citation to really encourage people to cite anybody's materials that you reuse. And you can get the citations in lots of different citation styles, style guides. And then another thing that integrates that I think is really nice is your article management system. So things like Zotero and Mendeley both integrate in here. So I have one of my folders that's got a lot of articles on research data management, if you're interested. So that's kind of the really quick overview of what a OSF project looks like. Again, because I have affiliated Duke University with it, it will show up on that Duke branded page. And you can see this is public. So I'll put the link to the link to it in the chat right now, so you guys can check it out if you're interested. There are some basic analytics that you get for projects once they're made public. And all of the links also for like individual files. So if I wanted to share out the link to the Franklin file, that's also a persistent URL that they're assigning for all of these materials. So that's really nice for sharing. The other quick thing I was going to show you all about OSF is a registration. So this is they have their own registry called OSF Registries. And again, this is where you're starting a study. You're going to document clearly your research questions, your hypotheses, information on, this is a really robust one that I noticed that has really clear information on like what data sets you're going to use, information on the variables that you may be analyzing. So really going into that depth of detail, so that then after you perform your analyses, even if you get negative results, people can really see that process. And some journals are doing a process called registered reports. If you're not familiar with them, that's where you essentially do this like pre-registration, and you submit a report that has your complete analysis plan, and they essentially promise to publish the results. It goes through a peer review process at that point, and then they, if they accept it, promise to publish the results, whether they're positive or negative. And this is really trying to change some of the problems we have in academia around, only wanting to publish positive results, and things around p-hacking and harking. So all of this is part of creating that culture that provides more transparency and reproducibility to our research. And then you can also associate your pre-registration with an OSF project. And then they've gotten these new things called open practice badges, which is kind of cool. So if you share your data in a repository, let's say you share it in a disciplinary repository, and you've created this pre-registration, then you can go in and add the DOI to where your data has been shared. And then on your pre-registration, it'll link out to that and give you a nifty badge that says you've contributed to open practices and research by sharing your data. Or the same thing with your code. If you're using Git and GitHub for your code, providing a link to that there. So it's a new feature, but I think it's kind of cool. So that is my really quick walkthrough of OSF. I want to pause now to see if anybody has any questions really on any of our tools that we've discussed. And I'm going to make space for that. But while we do that, Jen's going to put the link to the attendance form in the chat. With the attendance form, just a quick note, you click on the link, and then you'll be taken to a screen to log in with your DukeNet ID. And then you just have to answer like a couple quick questions. You shouldn't even have to put in like your name or anything, because all of that is being collected via the Shibboleth login through Qualtrics. So you should receive, though, a confirmation email. So make sure you keep that confirmation email, so that just in case if anything goes wrong with our record keeping, which given I just gave a long lecture on documentation and organization, we try our best to make sure that everything goes smoothly. But yes, please do keep that confirmation email. And then we'll also put into the chat a form for some feedback. So we have just a couple questions if you'd like to share some of the things that you've learned, or things that might still be a little confusing to you, or if you just have any other feedback, we'd love to hear from you. And now I'm going to stop talking. Again, if you have any questions accessing particularly attendance form, please let us know ASAP, because again, that's how we're going to collect and report back to the graduate school. And even if you're not here for RCR credit, but you're Duke, if you can fill out the form, just because it's good for, we want to track who was here. So I know we had some faculty and staff and undergrads that had registered. If you're in that group, please still fill it out, just so that we have that for our tracking purposes internally. Oh, so one other thing that we wanted to mention, and we'll be sending this out. We do have a tool handout, and we put together also a tool assessment template. So we're not really going to go through all these questions right now, but I think it's useful to sometimes, we just presented some tools to you, to take that time to strategically consider, how that tool is going to support your practices. What are some of the features that might be particularly important to your research team or group that you're working with? And then, implementing a new tool isn't always, it can take some time and effort. And so really determining, what challenge is it helping you solve, and then being thoughtful about the time that will take to implement, or to consider kind of getting other people on your team to buy into a particular tool. So the tool assessment template we have linked here is just a way to kind of think through some of the different features in a tool, and just do that strategic thinking before jumping feet first into a new tool. I think tools are great. Don't get me wrong. I think they can solve a lot of problems for people and can streamline your workflows, but I just think we want to be really thoughtful before adopting a new tool. All right, so I'm going to stop talking now. Again, I open it up if anybody has any questions, any of the tools or things we covered today. Well, if not, I want to thank you for your participation and for being here with us today. If you have questions that come up at any other time, we have our contact information here. And again, we'll be sending out the slides to everyone with, again, contact information for the various teams that for both us in CDVS and the Assist office, if you'd like to work with them with LabArchives. So thank you very much. And yeah, we'll be sticking around for just a couple minutes in case somebody had a burning question, but otherwise, I hope everyone has a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thanks.